The gavel crashed down with a deafening bang, slicing through the air like a blade, demanding silence, demanding submission. The noise ricocheted off the grand marble walls of the courtroom, swallowing the murmurs, snuffing out any hint of defiance. A suffocating stillness took hold of the room, thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken truths. All eyes locked onto the woman standing alone at the defendant's table, her dark skin glowing under the stark, unforgiving lights above. She did not tremble. She did not cower. Her spine remained straight, her hands rested steady on the wooden surface before her, and her expression, calm, unreadable, was a direct affront to the man who loomed over her from the judge's bench. The authority in this room, the one who dictated justice or destruction, the one whose power was absolute, at least within these walls. But something about her, something about the way she held herself, ignited a fire deep inside him. She wasn't afraid. And that made him furious. His fingers curled around the edge of the desk, knuckles whitening with restrained fury as his pale blue eyes narrowed, drilling into her with the kind of contempt that could crush a weaker soul. His voice, low and deliberate, slithered through the silent chamber like a venomous serpent. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he sneered, his lips curling, disgust evident in every syllable. "You think that just because you have a voice, you should be allowed to use it? Because let me remind you of something that people like you always seem to forget, this is my courtroom. My word is law. And in here, your place is beneath my feet." The tension in the room constricted, tightening around throats like an invisible noose. The jury, 12 white faces, blank and lifeless like mannequins, sat motionless, absorbing the scene without so much as a flicker of reaction. The stenographer continued typing, her fingers moving at a steady, robotic pace, her expression carefully neutral, as if she were merely a vessel, recording words without judgment. The bailiff shifted uneasily, the leather of his belt creaking as he adjusted it, his fingers twitching at his side, but he remained silent. No one intervened. No one ever did. This was the way it had always been, the way it was meant to be. A well-oiled machine where injustice was served with a smile, where the illusion of fairness masked the grotesque reality beneath. But the woman did not falter. She met his gaze, unwavering, her deep brown eyes burning with something dangerous, something unyielding, something that refused to be extinguished. There was no fear there, no submission, no desperate plea for mercy. Only defiance. Only an unshaken resolve that sent an uncomfortable shiver crawling down his spine. How dare she? How dare she stand before him, accused, condemned, and still look at him as if he were the one being judged? His nostrils flared, a sick heat crawling up his neck, his fury bubbling just beneath the surface, itching to be unleashed. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see the realization dawn on her face that she was nothing here, that he could destroy her with a single word. His voice dropped lower, a growl vibrating through clenched teeth. "You're a disgrace," he spat, each word slicing through the charged air like a dagger. "You were given every opportunity to sit down, to keep your mouth shut, to accept your fate like the rest of your kind. But instead, you chose arrogance. You chose to stand here and insult this court with your delusions of innocence. So let me educate you on reality, since you clearly have no understanding of it." She opened her mouth, prepared to speak, to challenge him again, but the gavel slammed down once more, cutting her off before a single syllable could escape. The sound rang through the room like a gunshot, final and merciless. "You are guilty," he declared, his voice booming, echoing off the high ceilings, drowning out any possible rebuttal. "Guilty of contempt. Guilty of insubordination. Guilty of thinking that you have a say in how this plays out. But let me tell you something, and I want you to listen closely, this is not about evidence. This is not about justice. This is about power. And I hold it. You do not." A long, heavy pause followed, stretching out like a thin wire ready to snap. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating, undeniable. "Take her," he barked, snapping his fingers at the bailiff. Let her spend the night in holding. Maybe then she'll learn her place. For the first time, there was hesitation. The bailiff didn't move immediately, his hand hovering near his holster, uncertainty flickering across his weathered face. It was small, barely noticeable, but the judge saw it. His irritation deepened into something uglier. He would not be questioned. He would not be challenged. "I said take her," he roared, the force of his voice sending an involuntary jolt through the bailiff's body. Two officers stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor, their hands already reaching for the cuffs. They loomed over her, towering figures of authority, their shadows stretching long and menacing beneath the harsh lighting. Still, she did not resist. Did not flinch. Did not tremble. She simply turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the room, lingering on each person as if she were memorizing their faces, branding them into her mind. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it sent something sharp and uneasy crawling through his veins. As they grabbed her arms, steel clamping down on her wrists, a whisper rippled through the courtroom like the first drops of rain before a storm. She should have kept quiet. She had it coming. He made an example of her. The judge sat back, exhaling slowly, allowing the satisfaction to wash over him, the pleasure of putting her in her place, of ensuring that she would walk out of this courtroom not as the woman who dared to challenge him, but as a cautionary tale for anyone else who might think they had the right to stand where they did not belong. And yet, something gnawed at him. The way she looked at him. The way she accepted the cuffs, the humiliation, the injustice, without breaking. Without faltering. As if she knew something he didn't. A cold trickle of doubt slithered down his spine. Who was she? Why wasn't she afraid? And why did it feel like, despite everything, he was the one who had just lost? To every black listener watching this video, we stand with you. Plow of Twist does not tolerate racism in any form. This story is a reminder that injustice should never go unchallenged, and that truth and justice will always find a way. Your voice matters, your story matters, and you are valued. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful twist. Now, let's dive in. The city of Atlanta was a paradox, an ever-expanding skyline of glass and steel, built on streets still haunted by ghosts of a past that refused to fade. It was a city where old money and new ambition clashed beneath the surface, where history whispered in the cracks of the pavement, and where power was wielded like a weapon by those who had spent generations sharpening its edges. Beneath the polished facades of law firms and courthouses, beneath the well-rehearsed speeches of politicians who promised change but delivered only convenience, the system remained unshaken, unbreakable, designed to protect those who had always ruled and to keep those who dared to challenge it in their place. It was in this city, in the heart of its grandest courthouse, that Camille Harrington found herself standing on trial, not for a crime she had committed, but for the audacity of believing that truth had a place in a world built on lies. Camille had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and she had never been naive enough to believe that the system she worked within was fair. She had seen the scales tip time and time again, had watched as men in power twisted laws into shields to protect themselves and weapons to destroy those who stood in their way. But she had believed, foolishly, perhaps, that her position, her achievements, her undeniable record of excellence, would shield her from the very injustice she had spent decades dismantling. She had believed that facts mattered, that evidence spoke louder than prejudice, that the foundation of justice could withstand even the most insidious attempts to corrupt it. She had believed in those things, right up until the moment Judge Richard Calloway had made it clear that this trial had never been about the law. Richard Calloway was not a man who had earned his place, he had inherited it. Born into a family of wealth, legacy, and privilege, his career had been paved long before he had ever stepped foot in a courtroom. He had never needed to struggle, never needed to prove himself, never needed to fight for the opportunities that others spent their lives clawing toward. His father, his grandfather, and the generations before them had all worn the robe, had all sat in judgment of those who did not belong in their world, had all ensured that the power they wielded remained untouchable. It was not intellect or merit that had made him a judge, it was lineage. And with that lineage came an unwavering belief that the world belonged to men like him. That the law was not an objective force, but a tool to be used at his discretion. That he could shape it, bend it, break it, and no one would ever dare to question him. For years, Calloway had operated without consequence. He had built his reputation on rulings that served the powerful and crushed the weak, on decisions that reinforced the very structures of oppression that he claimed to dismantle. He was careful, meticulous in his corruption, never reckless enough to leave a trail that could lead back to him. And in his courtroom, he was untouchable. He ruled with an iron fist, and those who challenged him learned quickly that justice had no place in a room where he was God. Camille had never feared men like Calloway. She had spent years dismantling their arguments, exposing their contradictions, forcing them to reckon with the very laws they twisted in their favor. She had built a career on her intellect, her relentless pursuit of truth, her refusal to be intimidated by those who clung to power with desperate, aging hands. She had walked into that courtroom believing, foolishly, that facts would protect her. That the undeniable, irrefutable truth of her innocence would be enough to strip Calloway of the authority he wielded so carelessly. She had underestimated just how deep his hatred ran. The trial had been a performance from the very beginning, a carefully orchestrated display of power designed to humiliate, to remind her that no matter how many accolades she had earned, no matter how many battles she had won, she was still nothing more than a woman standing before a man who had already decided her fate. The prosecution had built their case on lies so thin they should have collapsed under the weight of scrutiny, but Calloway had allowed them to stand, had dismissed every objection, had made it clear that his courtroom was not a place for truth, but for spectacle. The jury had been selected with surgical precision, a group of faces that all blended together into a single, unshakable certainty: she would not walk out of this room free. Camille had watched it all unfold, had seen the chessboard for what it was, had known that every move she made had already been anticipated, countered, erased. And still, she had refused to bow. Still, she had stood in that courtroom, back straight, voice steady, daring Calloway to strip away the illusion of justice and reveal the corruption festering beneath. And he had. Without hesitation. Without pretense. His ruling had come down like a guillotine, swift and merciless, his voice laced with the smug certainty of a man who had never once faced a consequence for his actions. The jury had remained silent, complicit in their cowardice. The prosecution had smirked, satisfied in their victory. And the courtroom had watched, some with indifference, some with quiet shame, as Camille had been stripped of everything she had spent her life building. But even as the bailiff moved toward her, even as the cold steel of the cuffs closed around her wrists, even as Calloway sat back with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had won, she had not broken. She had not given him the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. She had not begged, had not pleaded, had not offered him the chance to believe that he had truly taken something from her. Because she knew something he didn't. Something that would unravel everything. Something that would turn his entire world upside down. Calloway thought this was the end of her story. He had no idea it was just the beginning. The cold metallic click of the handcuffs tightening around Camille Harrington's wrists echoed in the silent courtroom, a cruel punctuation to Judge Richard Calloway's smug declaration of power. The gavel had fallen, the sentence had been handed down, and yet, as Camille was led away, she held her head high, refusing to let them see the weight of this moment press down on her. The courtroom was a performance, and she had played her role perfectly, right up until the moment Calloway had made his final, irreversible mistake. He had assumed he had won. He had believed his word was the last. He had convinced himself that power was an unshakable thing, that because he had sat behind that bench for years, dictating the lives of those who stood before him, he would never have to answer for the decisions he made. But power, Camille knew, was never permanent. It was borrowed. It could be taken away. And Judge Richard Calloway was about to learn that the hard way. The transport to the holding cells was short, but every second was an exercise in restraint. The officers flanking her didn't speak, though their presence was unnecessary. She wasn't going to fight them, wasn't going to struggle, because she knew something they didn't. Every step she took, every breath she drew, was another moment bringing her closer to what she had spent years preparing for. As she was guided into the dimly lit corridor leading to the detention area, she could hear the low murmur of voices beyond the barred cells, the shifting of bodies on stiff cots, the occasional distant laugh of a guard who had long since become numb to the misery surrounding him. This was not the first time Camille had stepped into the belly of the system. She had seen this place from the other side, had worked cases that took her deep into the concrete labyrinth of injustice, had witnessed firsthand the way the machine chewed people up and spat them out, stripped of dignity, of hope, of identity. But today, she was not here as a lawyer. Today, she was the accused. The holding cell was small, bare except for a single metal bench bolted to the floor, the air thick with the scent of sweat and old desperation. The officer uncuffed her wrists with a practiced motion, stepping back as though expecting some reaction, some protest. She gave him none. She simply turned, met his gaze, and held it long enough for him to look away first. Then the door clanked shut, the heavy lock sliding into place. Footsteps retreated, voices faded, and Camille was left alone in the dim glow of the flickering overhead light. Alone, but not defeated. Alone, but not powerless. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaling slowly, letting the tension of the moment settle into something steadier. And then she waited. The hours passed, measured only by the shift changes of the guards, by the occasional muffled conversation filtering in from the hallway. She knew they were watching her, waiting for some sign of weakness, for the inevitable moment where she would crumble under the weight of it all. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When the door finally swung open again, she didn't look up immediately. The voice that greeted her was one she recognized instantly, smooth and controlled, yet carrying the faintest edge of urgency beneath its calm exterior. "Ms. Harrington, let's go." Camille lifted her gaze to see David Ellis, her attorney, standing just outside the cell, his face set in a careful mask of professionalism, though she could see the flicker of something else beneath it. David had been with her through countless battles, had stood beside her in cases that had pushed the limits of the law, had watched her tear down men in positions of power with nothing but facts and precision. But now, in this moment, even he looked uneasy. She stepped out of the cell without a word, walking past the guards who had spent the last few hours pretending not to watch her. David fell into step beside her, leading her down the corridor toward the exit. The air in the hallway felt different now, charged with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until they stepped outside into the cool night air, past the heavy iron doors of the detention center, that she realized why. The press was waiting. A sea of cameras and flashing lights, microphones raised, voices calling out questions in rapid succession. The story had broken faster than even she had expected. Reporters surged forward, their words blending into a chaotic blur. "Ms. Harrington, do you have a statement? Are you aware of the allegations against you? Was this trial a setup?" But she didn't stop, didn't acknowledge them. She kept walking, her face unreadable, as David guided her toward the waiting car. Inside the vehicle, the tension coiled tighter. David let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face before turning to her, his eyes searching. "They want you to disappear. That's why they did this. Calloway thinks this is enough to end you." Camille met his gaze, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Then he underestimated me." David studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I assume you have a plan." She smiled, the first real smile she had allowed herself all day. "Of course." The wheels were already in motion. Camille had spent her life understanding how power worked, how men like Calloway operated, how the system could be both manipulated and dismantled. She had always known that the fight for justice was never truly fought in courtrooms, but in the spaces between, where influence was wielded, where information was controlled, where truth was a weapon just as sharp as any gavel. And she had something Calloway didn't. Something that would turn the tide. As the car pulled away from the detention center, her mind was already calculating the next steps. Calloway had made his move. Now, it was her turn. And he had no idea what was coming. The weight of the moment settled into Judge Richard Calloway's chest like an iron grip, slowly tightening, suffocating, pressing against him with an intensity he refused to acknowledge. He had spent his entire career ensuring that his authority remained unshaken, that his word was final, that no decision he made could ever be challenged. The courtroom had always been his domain, a place where he dictated fate with a simple swing of his gavel, where he silenced those who dared to question his rulings, where the law bent itself to his will rather than the other way around. And yet, as he sat in the grand office that had belonged to generations of Calloways before him, his fingers tightening around the glass of whiskey he had poured himself, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, he could feel the first hints of something foreign creeping into his bloodstream: uncertainty. The news played in an endless loop, the headlines flashing across the screen in bold, unforgiving letters: Judge Calloway under federal investigation, possible judicial misconduct. The words burned themselves into his mind, searing, inescapable, as though they had been branded onto his skin. His grip around the glass tightened as he took a slow sip, letting the burn of the liquor settle in his throat, as if it could drown out the slow, creeping dread that was beginning to take root inside him. This was just noise, he told himself. A distraction. He had weathered worse storms before. He had spent decades burying the truth beneath layers of legal jargon, twisting reality to fit his own narrative, ensuring that no one, no matter how determined, could ever lay a hand on him. And yet, here it was. The beginning of something he could no longer control. The knock at his office door came too suddenly, too forcefully, the sound slicing through the tense silence like a blade. His jaw tightened as he turned toward it, already irritated, already preparing to snap at whoever dared to interrupt his moment of reflection. He was in no mood for pleasantries, in no mood for yet another staff member attempting to reassure him, in no mood for the meaningless promises of loyalty from those who had always been too afraid to challenge him. "Come in," he barked, his voice sharp, carrying the authority he had spent a lifetime cultivating. The door creaked open, and when Camille Harrington stepped inside, her presence filled the room with something electric, something unshakable, something that made the air feel heavier, charged, like the seconds before a lightning strike. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. Not after what had happened in his courtroom. Not after he had humiliated her, broken her, stripped her of everything. And yet, there she stood, composed, untouched by the weight of the accusations that had been hurled at her, unshaken by the destruction he had tried to bring down upon her. She closed the door behind her with deliberate ease, locking it with a quiet click that sent a slow ripple of unease crawling down his spine. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway did not feel like the most powerful person in the room. "You have no business being here," he said, his voice low, controlled, though he could hear the faintest edge of something else creeping in beneath the surface: uncertainty, irritation, something dangerously close to fear. "I could have you removed from the building for trespassing." Camille tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. A small, knowing smile played at the corner of her lips, a quiet, restrained amusement that sent a fresh wave of irritation coursing through him. "You could try," she said, her voice even, steady, unbothered. "But you won't." Calloway leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference, though he could feel it now, the shift in the air, the slow unraveling of the control he had spent decades mastering. "Is that so?" She stepped forward, her movements deliberate, unhurried, closing the distance between them in a way that made his pulse tick just a fraction faster. "You've spent your entire career believing you were untouchable," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something undeniable, something that pressed into him with an intensity he did not like. "You thought that courtroom was your kingdom, that you could twist the law however you pleased, as long as no one dared to challenge you. But you made a mistake, Calloway." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the words sink in, letting the moment press down on him like a slow, heavy weight. "You underestimated me." He scoffed, though it came out weaker than he intended, the sound not quite reaching the confidence he had meant for it to carry. "And what exactly do you think you've done, Harrington?" Her gaze did not waver. "I let you think you had control. I let you believe that you won. And while you were busy celebrating your victory, I was preparing to take everything from you." Something cold slithered down his spine, something that he refused to name. He forced himself to relax, forced himself to exhale, forced himself to reclaim the authority that felt as though it were slipping through his fingers like sand. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice measured, calculated. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Am I?" She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small device, and set it on his desk. A flash drive. Simple, unassuming, nothing more than a piece of plastic and metal, yet something about it made his stomach twist. "This," she said, tapping it once with the tip of her finger, "contains everything. Every case you manipulated. Every ruling that benefited the powerful at the expense of the innocent. Every under-the-table deal. Every lie you've ever told in the name of justice." His jaw clenched, his fingers curling against the arms of his chair. "You have nothing," he said, his tone sharp, dismissive, but there was something beneath the surface now, something he couldn't quite suppress. Her eyes flickered with something sharp, something lethal. "Then why are your hands shaking?" He looked down, realizing too late that his fingers had curled into fists, his knuckles white with tension. He forced himself to relax, to exhale, to regain control. "Even if you had something," he said, voice low, deliberate, "you think one flash drive is enough to bring me down? You think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, her words hitting him like a hammer. "I don't need to threaten you, Calloway. I already won." His mind raced, scanning for a way out, for a loophole, for an escape route. He had been in tight corners before, had maneuvered his way out of impossible situations. But this was different. This was personal. This was something he couldn't manipulate, something he couldn't twist, something he couldn't erase. Camille straightened, taking her time as she adjusted her coat, as if she had all the time in the world. "I wonder what the public will think when they hear the recordings. When they see the files. When they realize the man who sat in judgment of others was nothing more than a fraud." She tilted her head slightly. "I wonder what your colleagues will say. Or your family." His breath came faster now, shallow, barely controlled. "You have no proof." She reached into her pocket again, this time pulling out her phone. She tapped the screen, and a voice filled the room, his voice. "In this room, the law is me." The words, spoken in his own tone, filled the space between them, undeniable, inescapable. Camille watched as the blood drained from his face. "That's just the beginning," she said. "I have more. So much more." Silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Then, finally, Calloway exhaled shakily. "What do you want?" Camille studied him, and for the first time, he saw it, the quiet satisfaction, the unwavering certainty. "Justice," she said simply. "The kind you tried to deny me. The kind you've denied so many others." His hands clenched into fists again, his mind scrambling for a way out. But deep down, he knew, there was none. And for the first time in his life, Judge Richard Calloway was afraid. Richard Calloway's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven movements, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair as if holding on to something tangible could stop the world from closing in around him. His mind was racing, his thoughts colliding into one another in a desperate search for a way out, a way to undo what had already begun unraveling. He had spent decades controlling the narrative, ensuring that no decision he made could be questioned, that no one could ever wield enough power to challenge him. And yet, as he sat there, staring across his desk at Camille Harrington, he could feel that control slipping through his fingers like water. His entire world, everything he had built, everything he had manipulated, every carefully crafted lie, was balancing on the edge of a blade, and Camille was the one holding the hilt. Camille stood tall, her presence consuming every inch of the space between them, her posture unshaken, her expression steady. There was no doubt in her eyes, no hesitation, no second-guessing, and that terrified him more than the flash drive sitting on his desk, more than the weight of his own recorded words echoing in his ears. She had him trapped, and the worst part was that she wasn't even in a hurry to finish this. She was giving him time to sit with his fear, to process the reality of what was happening, to understand that for the first time in his life, he was on the other side of the judgment seat, and there was no escape. Calloway swallowed hard, the sound loud in the heavy silence between them. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, stripped of the confidence that had once made it so commanding. "If you release that," he said, his words careful, deliberate, as if choosing them correctly could still save him, "you'll destroy me." Camille didn't blink. "That's the idea." His fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms, a sharp contrast to the way she stood so effortlessly composed. He had spent his entire career dismantling people, watching them crumble under his rulings, his power, his influence, and yet now, faced with the inevitability of his own downfall, he found himself scrambling, clawing for a foothold, grasping for anything that could shift the tide back in his favor. "There has to be something you want," he tried again, his voice a shade closer to desperate now, the weight of panic slipping through the cracks. "I can fix this. I have connections, resources, whatever it is you want, I can make it happen." Camille tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words, before exhaling slowly. "The irony of this moment is almost poetic," she mused, her voice calm, thoughtful, as if she were observing a painting rather than standing in the wreckage of his carefully built empire. "All those years, all those people who sat in front of you, begging for mercy, asking for fairness, hoping that the law would protect them. And you turned your back on them. You silenced them. You made sure their voices never mattered." She took a step closer, and though he was still seated behind his desk, still technically in his place of authority, he had never felt smaller. "Now you're the one asking for mercy. The difference is, I don't owe you any." Calloway's pulse pounded in his ears, his body tense, his mind screaming at him to find a way out. He couldn't let this happen. He had built too much, climbed too high, sacrificed too many to get here. He refused to be brought down by her, by this woman who should have been nothing more than another name in his courtroom, another footnote in his long career of victories. He had won. He had won. He forced his expression into something closer to control, a last attempt at regaining some measure of authority. "You think you can take me down with a few recordings? You think one flash drive is enough to erase everything I've built? I have power, Camille. Real power. The kind that doesn't just disappear because you will it to." Camille let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it, only something sharp, something knowing. "You don't understand what's happening, do you?" she said, her voice almost pitying. "This isn't just about me. It's bigger than that. While you were sitting here, trying to figure out how to save yourself, the world outside was already turning against you." She gestured toward the television, the news still rolling, the weight of his name being dissected by anchors and analysts, his legacy being stripped apart, thread by thread. "Your power was never real, Calloway. It was borrowed. It was given to you by people who thought you could be useful to them. But now, you're a liability. And trust me, the second they realize you're not worth protecting, they'll throw you to the wolves without a second thought." Calloway's mouth was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew she was right. He had seen it happen before, had watched powerful men fall, not because they had lost their grip but because those around them had decided they were no longer worth protecting. He had been on the other side of this, had orchestrated downfalls, had turned his back on men who had once stood beside him. He had told himself it would never happen to him. That he was smarter, stronger, more untouchable. But now, as the walls closed in, as Camille stood before him, unbreakable, unstoppable, he realized how foolish that belief had been. Camille leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to send a slow, cold chill through him. You can fight it. You can scramble, try to claw your way out. But it won't matter. The truth is already out there. The world is watching. The question is, how do you want to go down? Kicking and screaming, begging for deals that won't come? Or do you want to at least pretend you still have some dignity left? Calloway felt his stomach twist, bile rising in his throat. He had spent years making decisions that shaped the lives of others, never once considering that one day, he would be the one left without options. His mind scrambled, reaching for something, anything, but all he could see was the inevitable. There was no way out. No deal to be made. No favor to call in. His name was already being dragged through the mud, his reputation already shattered, and soon, there would be nothing left. Camille exhaled slowly, watching him with quiet finality. The time for games is over, she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. You know what's coming. You've spent your life playing judge, jury, and executioner. But now it's your turn to face judgment. Calloway's vision blurred slightly, his breathing unsteady. His mind screamed at him to fight, to deny, to claw his way back into control. But for the first time in his life, there was no control left to claim. And Camille Harrington? She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to watch him fall. The walls of Richard Calloway's world were closing in faster than he could grasp, each passing second tightening the noose of consequences he had once believed himself immune to. His hands, which had once so confidently wielded the gavel, dictating the fate of countless lives, now trembled against the polished mahogany of his desk. The weight of Camille Harrington's words still lingered in the air, settling over him like a slow, suffocating storm. For years, he had been the one passing judgment, the one deciding who walked free and who suffered under the full weight of the law. He had sat behind that bench like a king, believing himself above reproach, untouchable, invincible. And yet, here he was, stripped of the very power he had clung to, trapped beneath the weight of his own corruption. Camille hadn't just exposed him, she had undone him in a way he hadn't thought possible. The room felt smaller now, suffocatingly so. The warm amber of his whiskey no longer brought him any comfort. It burned on his tongue, but it did nothing to drown out the truth that was closing in from all sides. The news was spreading like wildfire, headlines flashing across the country, reporters circling like vultures, the world that had once cowered beneath his authority now watching in anticipation of his fall. His colleagues, men who had once stood beside him, who had shaken his hand, who had nodded in agreement as he shaped the judicial system in his own image, were already beginning to distance themselves. He could see it in their statements, the carefully crafted words designed to sever ties without condemning him outright. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability, a sinking ship they would abandon without a second thought. The power he had wielded for so long was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of denial could change that. Camille stood across from him, unshaken, unmovable, the quiet force of justice made flesh. She had not come for revenge. Revenge would have been personal. This was bigger than that. This was the weight of every verdict he had twisted, every life he had ruined, every injustice he had overseen coming back to collect its debt. And she was simply the one holding the ledger. You never thought this day would come, did you? Her voice cut through the silence, steady, measured, carrying none of the rage he had expected. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no gloating, no pleasure in his downfall. That made it worse. If she had come to destroy him out of anger, if she had shouted, if she had cursed his name, he could have convinced himself that this was simply an attack, an act of personal vengeance. But this? This was methodical, calculated. This was justice stripping him bare, revealing him for what he truly was. His mouth felt dry, the words he wanted to say tangled somewhere in the back of his throat. He had spent his entire life in control, dictating the course of others' lives with ease, and yet, now that the tables had turned, he found himself unable to summon even a single defense that wouldn't crumble under the weight of the truth. Camille stepped closer, her voice dropping just enough to press against him like the final nail in his coffin. "Do you understand what's happening, Calloway?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him, dissecting him. "This isn't just about exposing you. This isn't about making sure you face consequences. This is about making sure no one like you ever sits behind that bench again." His jaw clenched, the muscles twitching as he forced himself to breathe, forced himself to keep his composure even as his world collapsed around him. "You think this changes anything?" he managed, his voice rough, the last embers of his arrogance flickering weakly in the growing darkness. "You think taking me down will fix the system?" He let out a hollow laugh, though it lacked the confidence it once carried. "There will always be more men like me. You can't change that." Camille studied him for a moment, then exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "No," she admitted. "I can't erase people like you from existence. But I can make sure the next one thinks twice before he sits in that chair." The silence between them stretched, thick, charged with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Outside the office, the world was shifting, reshaping itself around the reality of Calloway's downfall. His name, once untouchable, was now synonymous with corruption. His reputation, once ironclad, was unraveling thread by thread. There would be no quiet retirement, no escape into obscurity. This would follow him, consume him, define his legacy in ways he had never imagined. He thought of the men who had come before him, his father, his grandfather, the generations of Calloways who had sat on the bench, who had wielded power as if it were their birthright. He had always believed he would carry on that legacy, that his name would be spoken with the same reverence, the same unshakable authority. But now, he saw the truth. There would be no statues erected in his honor, no buildings named after him. His legacy would not be one of power but of disgrace. He would be remembered, yes, but not for the reasons he had once envisioned. His breathing was shallow now, his hands still clenched into fists, the cold weight of inevitability pressing down on him like a judge's final ruling. Camille had not come to bargain. There was no deal to be made, no loophole to exploit, no strings to pull. The sentence had already been passed, and for the first time in his life, Richard Calloway was on the receiving end of justice he could not escape. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Camille's gaze held his, steady, unrelenting. "Now," she said, her tone quiet, final. "Now you watch everything you built crumble. And this time, no one is coming to save you." The words landed like a final blow, sinking deep into the hollow pit in his chest where his certainty had once lived. There was no comeback, no final act of defiance, no masterstroke to turn the tide. He had reached the end of the road, and there was nothing left but the wreckage of the empire he had built. The air in the room was suffocating, the weight of consequence settling in every corner, every crevice. Outside, the world moved on without him, the foundation of his power already eroding beneath the feet of those who had once stood beside him. And as Camille turned, walking away without another word, Calloway realized the cruelest truth of all. Justice had never been blind. It had simply been waiting. The weight of silence in Richard Calloway's office was suffocating, thick like the humidity before a storm, pressing down on his chest, making every breath feel like an effort. He had been in difficult situations before, had faced public scrutiny, had maneuvered around controversy with the precision of a man who knew exactly which strings to pull, which hands to shake, which doors to close before the wrong people could walk through them. But this was different. This wasn't a scandal to be buried under legal jargon, wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment that could be spun into something palatable for the press. This wasn't about optics or damage control. This was about consequences, real and inescapable, the kind that could not be bargained with or silenced with a carefully worded statement. And Camille Harrington, standing across from him with the unshakable presence of a woman who knew exactly what she had done, was the architect of his ruin. He had always underestimated people like her. He had assumed that power belonged only to those who inherited it, to those who sat at the right tables, whispered in the right ears, carried the right last names. He had dismissed her, just as he had dismissed so many before her, believing that intelligence without power was nothing more than noise, a temporary nuisance that could be drowned out with the right application of force. But now, looking at her, standing tall, unshaken, looking down at him not with anger or triumph but with something far worse, certainty, he understood how wrong he had been. She had known all along what this moment would be. She had planned it, orchestrated it, let him walk himself into his own destruction, step by step, ruling by ruling, until he had no ground left to stand on. His hands twitched against the polished wood of his desk, his fingers curling into fists before he forced them to relax. His entire life had been spent crafting an image, a presence, a reputation so airtight that no one had dared question it. He had been the law. And now, he was nothing. He had been stripped down to the truth of himself, and he wasn't sure he could survive what that truth looked like. Camille's voice cut through the stillness, her words measured, precise, each syllable striking him with the force of a verdict being read aloud. "You always thought power was permanent, didn't you?" she mused, tilting her head slightly, studying him with something almost resembling curiosity. "You thought you could mold the law into whatever shape suited you, that as long as you controlled the narrative, as long as the right people stood behind you, nothing could ever touch you. But you never realized that power, real power, isn't about who holds the gavel. It's about who controls the truth." He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, the tension in his shoulders turning sharp and unforgiving. "You think this makes you better than me?" His voice was lower now, rougher, as though each word was being forced through clenched teeth. "You think standing here, tearing everything down, makes you any less ruthless than the men you claim to despise?" Her expression didn't change, didn't waver, but something in her gaze sharpened. "This isn't about being better than you," she said, and the calm in her tone made his stomach twist. "This is about justice. Not the kind you twisted and sold to the highest bidder, but the kind that holds men like you accountable. The kind you never thought you'd have to face." He let out a hollow laugh, though there was no amusement in it, only bitterness, only the sound of a man grasping at the last remnants of his pride. "And what happens when the next man takes my place? You think you've changed anything? There will always be another Calloway, another judge who knows how to bend the system to his will, another man who understands that the law is nothing more than a game if you know how to play it." Camille leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the space between them, just enough for him to feel the weight of what she was about to say before she even spoke. "Maybe," she admitted, her voice still steady, still infuriatingly composed. "But now, they'll have to look over their shoulder. Now, they'll know that they're not untouchable. That one day, someone like me will come for them too." His breath came faster now, shallower, his pulse hammering against his ribs as the full force of what she had done settled over him like a suffocating fog. He had spent his life believing himself above the law, above the people who stood before him in courtrooms, above the rules that applied to lesser men. But there were no more favors to call in, no more powerful friends willing to protect him. He was, for the first time, truly alone. The knock at the door was loud, final, the sound sending an almost imperceptible jolt through his body. He knew what it meant. Knew that the world outside of this office had already moved past him, that his downfall was no longer a possibility but an inevitability. Camille didn't move, didn't so much as glance at the door, because she had already won, and they both knew it. His voice was quiet now, almost hollow. "How long have you been planning this?" Camille exhaled slowly, as though considering the question, before finally answering. "Long enough," she said simply. "Long enough to make sure there was no way out for you." The words hit harder than he expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Because she had stripped him of the illusion he had built around himself, of the belief that he could always find a way to come out on top. He had spent his life believing himself to be the architect of others' fates, but in the end, it was his own that had been carefully, methodically constructed, brick by brick, misstep by misstep, until there was no path left but the one she had laid out for him. The door opened, and for the first time, he didn't turn to face whoever had entered. He didn't need to. He already knew. The weight of law enforcement, of legal proceedings he could no longer control, of consequences he had never thought would touch him, filled the space like an inevitability. But it was Camille who spoke next, and it was her voice, not theirs, that sealed his fate. "You spent your life making decisions that destroyed others," she said, and though there was no anger in her tone, there was something even more damning, certainty. "Now it's time for you to live with the consequences of your own." For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway had no words. No escape. No power left to wield. And for the first time, the law had truly caught up with him. The weight of the cold steel handcuffs digging into Richard Calloway's wrists was a sensation he had never imagined experiencing, not in his worst nightmares, not in the quiet moments of self-reflection where his mind wandered into hypothetical impossibilities. And yet, here he was, bound, helpless, powerless in a way that was foreign and humiliating, his once proud hands now trembling against the weight of the justice he had spent years bending to his will. His entire world, everything he had built, every connection he had leveraged, every favor he had called in over the decades, was crumbling around him, and he had no power left to stop it. His mind raced, desperate for a way out, for some final loophole, some last-ditch effort to claw his way back into control, but the truth was undeniable, sinking into him like a slow-moving poison. This was real. This was happening. He had spent years crafting an image of invincibility, had walked through life believing himself untouchable, a man above consequence, above scrutiny, above the very system he had shaped to serve him. But now, that system had turned its gaze on him, and there was no mercy in it, no leniency, no escape route carved out for men like him. The irony was suffocating, pressing down on his chest, making each breath feel shallow, incomplete, as though his body itself was rejecting the reality of what was unfolding. The room that had once been his sanctuary, his fortress, the place where he had orchestrated the rise and fall of so many others, now felt like a prison, every inch of it saturated with the weight of his downfall. The leather chair behind his desk, where he had sat with the confidence of a king, issuing decisions that shaped lives with the flick of a pen, now looked like an empty throne abandoned by its ruler. The bookshelves, lined with volumes of law, texts he had used not as tools of justice but as weapons of manipulation, stood untouched, mocking him with their presence. The framed photographs of past Calloways, generations of men who had wielded the same power he had, stared down at him, their expressions frozen in time, their legacy now irreversibly stained by the disgrace of the man who had come last in their line. His name, once spoken with deference, was now being dragged through the mud in real time, flashing across television screens, dissected by news anchors and legal analysts, torn apart by the very voices that had once praised him. The world was watching him fall, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. Camille Harrington stood just a few feet away, her posture unshaken, her face unreadable, a presence so calm and unbothered that it only deepened the panic rising in his chest. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no cruelty, no enjoyment in watching him unravel, and that, more than anything, made it unbearable. If she had been gloating, if she had been screaming, if she had been filled with rage, he could have told himself this was nothing more than revenge, personal and petty, an emotional vendetta that he could dismiss as irrational. But she wasn't here for vengeance, she was here for justice, real justice, the kind he had convinced himself didn't exist, the kind he had spent years making sure didn't exist for people who stood before him in the courtroom. She had known exactly how this would play out, had orchestrated it so meticulously that it was clear this wasn't a victory she had stumbled into. This had been inevitable. This had been a long time coming. And now, as the final moments of his reign slipped through his fingers, he realized how blind he had been to the storm gathering around him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the bitterness of defeat sitting heavy on his tongue. He had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, ensuring that no story could ever be told in which he was the villain, and yet here he was, center stage in a scandal that had already rewritten his legacy. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, raw, stripped of the authority that had once made it so commanding. You think what you've done here will change anything? The words felt weak the moment they left his mouth, but he pushed forward, clinging to what little defiance he had left. You think taking me down will fix the system? There will always be another judge like me, another man who knows how to work the system, another name ready to take my place. He forced out a hollow laugh, but it lacked conviction, lacked the strength he had always carried in his voice. The law doesn't change just because one man falls. Camille didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even seem remotely fazed by his words. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if she had expected this, as if she had already considered every argument, every weak attempt at justification, and had already dismissed them before they even left his mouth. No, she admitted, her tone quiet but firm. I can't erase people like you. But I can make sure the next one thinks twice before he follows in your footsteps. There was no anger in her voice, no hatred, no emotion that he could latch onto and twist into something else. She was simply stating a fact, and somehow, that made it more devastating. His hands clenched at his sides, the weight of his restraints a constant reminder of his new reality. He had spent years making decisions that sealed people's fates, had watched as men and women broke down before him, pleading for mercy, begging for leniency, knowing that their words meant nothing to him. He had dismissed them without thought, without care, had convinced himself that justice was whatever he decided it was. And now, he was the one pleading, the one grasping for mercy, the one who had no power left to wield. The realization settled over him like a slow, crushing weight. He had never believed in fairness, had never believed that the system would ever turn on men like him. But here he was, and there was no one left to protect him. The knock on the door was sharp, commanding, final. The officers at his side shifted slightly, waiting, patient, as though they had seen this scenario play out 1,000 times before. He had sentenced men to this fate with the same detached efficiency they now carried, had ordered people to be taken away without a second thought, and yet now, as the moment stretched unbearably, as the reality of what was happening cemented itself into his bones, he felt something he had never once experienced in his lifetime. Fear. He turned his gaze back to Camille, searching for something, anything, but found nothing that would save him. You've ruined me, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, hollow in a way that he hadn't expected. Camille didn't blink, didn't hesitate. No, she said, her voice calm, unwavering. You did that to yourself. The door swung open, and the world outside crashed in, the flashing of cameras blinding, the roar of voices deafening, the collective force of his downfall swallowing him whole. The officers took their cue, moving him forward, their grip firm but not aggressive, as if he was already just another case to be processed, another name on the long list of those who had fallen from grace. He wanted to fight, wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to stop what was happening, but there was no stopping it. The law, the same law he had once twisted to his will, had finally turned its unrelenting gaze on him. And Camille Harrington? She didn't need to watch him be taken away. She had already won. The weight of Richard Calloway's fall echoed long after the courtroom doors closed behind him, reverberating through the halls of power he once walked with absolute confidence. The news of his arrest had ignited a firestorm across the country, shaking the very foundations of the legal system he had spent his life controlling. The media dissected his every decision, unearthing cases that had long been buried, stories of families torn apart by his rulings, lives shattered in the name of his so-called justice. The same people who had once stood by him, who had benefited from his power, were now the first to distance themselves, eager to erase any association before the flames of his disgrace could spread to them. He had always believed that power made him untouchable, that his name alone would shield him from consequences. But as he sat in his prison cell, stripped of his title, his influence, his carefully curated world, he realized the cruelest truth of all: power was never truly his. It had been borrowed, a privilege extended to him by a system that only valued strength, and now that he was weak, that same system had cast him aside like he was nothing. He had spent his life watching others break under the weight of his judgments, but now, he was the one who had been condemned. And there was no appeal left to file, no loophole left to exploit. This was his sentence. Camille Harrington, however, did not stop when the verdict was handed down. She knew that Calloway's conviction was not the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. His fall had set off a chain reaction, exposing the deep, rotting corruption embedded in the very foundation of the justice system, a system that had never been designed to protect people like her, people who had been silenced, overlooked, buried under decisions made by men who had never once seen them as equals. And now, for the first time, the country was paying attention. People who had once accepted injustice as an inevitability were starting to question the way things had always been, demanding accountability, demanding change. Camille did not relish in Calloway's downfall, did not waste time celebrating his misery, because she understood that this was bigger than him. It had never been about one man. It had been about dismantling the power structures that allowed men like him to exist in the first place. And now, standing at the forefront of that fight, she knew her work was far from over. She continued to push forward, her name now carrying more weight than ever before, not as a victim of injustice but as the woman who had fought back and won. She became the face of a movement, a force that could not be silenced, using every platform, every connection, every ounce of influence she had gained from the trial to push for reforms that once seemed impossible. Where Calloway had once ruled unchallenged, new voices now filled the void he had left behind, people demanding fairness, demanding oversight, demanding that no judge, no officer, no politician would ever again wield unchecked power without fear of consequence. She knew change would not come overnight, knew that the fight ahead would be just as brutal as the one she had already won. But she was ready. She had been ready long before this battle had begun. And now, with the world watching, she would not stop until justice was no longer something people had to fight for, it would simply be their right. As for Calloway, he spent his days in the silence of his cell, the walls around him offering none of the comfort they once had. The voices that once praised him had long since faded, replaced by the low murmurs of inmates who knew exactly who he was, who recognized the man who had once condemned them without a second thought. He was no longer the judge, no longer the untouchable figure sitting above them, now, he was just another prisoner, just another name in a system he had built to break others. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, no matter how many times he told himself that this was temporary, that somehow, some way, he would find a way out, he knew the truth. This was his reality now. And for the first time in his life, there was no one left to save him. This story is not just about revenge, nor is it simply about one corrupt man finally facing the justice he denied so many others. This is about the power of truth, about the strength it takes to stand up against a system that was never meant to protect you, about what happens when those who have been silenced refuse to stay quiet any longer. Camille's victory was not just her own, it belonged to every person who had ever been told to accept injustice, to endure unfairness, to believe that their voice did not matter. It was a reminder that power is not absolute, that no man, no matter how high he sits, is beyond accountability. And perhaps most importantly, it was proof that change is possible. That when the right people refuse to back down, when they refuse to be intimidated, refuse to be silenced, even the most unshakable foundations can crumble. So now, I ask you, what do you take from this story? What does justice truly mean to you? Do you believe that those in power should be held to the same standards they impose on others? Or do you think the system will always protect its own? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your own experiences with injustice, if you have them. Because this isn't just a story. This is a conversation. And if you enjoyed this story, if you want to hear more tales of truth, justice, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for the next unexpected turn. Because if there's one thing you can always count on here, it's that the story is never what you expect.